Hi, it's Amy Shaw here, and I want to talk today about ancestral clearing and how important that is. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience, but I just want to say that this has really kind of been coming up for me, even though I've done a lot of this work in my own family. This has been coming up for the last 2 or 3 weeks. I went to a luncheon where a friend of mine spoke about ancestral clearing and lineage and stuff like that. It was really interesting, and I probably maybe we'll talk a little bit about something that came up during that, a question that someone else who was attending had. But before I get into that, I wanted to also mention that last week we took my granddaughter, my husband and I, to go see the Disney movie Coco, which was an amazing movie, and I loved it so much. I'm glad we went. It was an incredible story, actually, about ancestral curses and, the lineage and, the Hispanic culture with the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, and how important that is to them. It really gave insight into that ceremony and practice that they do, what it's for. And so the whole movie actually was built around that, the Dia de los Muertos, and Coco, the grandmother who passed on, and so the whole story was really about the little boy trying to clear the ancestral curse and heal the trauma that was obviously carried down the family lineage and was affecting him and his life and his ability to soulfully express what he came to express. So it was an amazing story, and I just my kids get so irritated with me whenever I say it was so shamanic, because they say, you say that about everything, Mom, but really I feel that it was a really shamanic movie. And it really honored the Hispanic culture, and I just appreciate it so much. I related to it because I've had to do a lot of that work myself. So let me just jump in and talk a little bit about the work that I've done in my own life and having to do some ancestral healing and clearing. I grew up with this sort of narrative that depression runs in my family. My dad's mother, who was the daughter of a first-generation Irish immigrant, he actually was a congressman for the state of Montana, an attorney, and pretty prominent man. So she was raised by him. When my dad was about 3 years old, this was in 1952, she allegedly ran the car head-on into a tree. With my dad and his sister, my Aunt Virginia, in the vehicle. My dad was so young. He just has like this vague memory of like having, some head trauma. It wasn't like so severe that, it was like not closed head trauma. It was more, I think, external. But at the time, in 1952, they say that she did it intentionally. She was trying to kill herself and her kids. I don't really know. All I know is this is a story that was told to me. So from 1952 to 1972, my grandmother, my dad's mother, spent in the California State Psychiatric Hospital in Southern California. And she had to endure, involuntary shock treatments for pretty much those 20 years. And I imagine towards the end of her life that was forced medications as well. So, that was very, very, very traumatizing to my dad. It was an early, sort of wounding mother loss very early on in his life. He basically grew up, with just a single parent. His dad also died when my dad was a teenager of cancer. So, my dad had a really hard life. And so I grew up with this, dad who was significantly wounded, and this long lineage and this story, this narrative about how depression runs in our family. Many, many, many times I recall hearing my dad talk about being suicidal. When I lived with him alone, it was just him and I for a brief period before he ultimately completely abandoned me when I was 10. I remember he would go to get ready to go to work in the morning, and he would tell me, oh, I might not come back. My car just might find its way off the edge of the cliff or something. And so he always had this sort of like this threat of suicidality that as a child, it scared me. It really scared me. So, I had bouts of depression when I was a teenager. I was hospitalized. I had many suicide attempts. And so I had this long-standing narrative of depression. Well, about 10 years ago, it really started to haunt me about this grandmother. I always had this in my mind, but I started doing genealogy research on both sides of my family, my mom's side and my dad's side, and her side, but just the whole tree. I was really digging in and doing genealogy research. It was after my cancer diagnosis, and I was at home, wasn't working, and had a lot of time, and everything's so digital now. And so I joined Ancestry.com and really started building on a family tree, and just rethinking about this grandmother. Although she had always been like basically right here at my shoulder, it really brought this back up, and I really started feeling this need to like connect with her, to understand this narrative that I was told my dad was for at the time. Did it really happen like that? And did she really intentionally do that? And the culture was very peculiar at that time, and how it treated women, and was she really mentally ill? And just, what traumas did she endure being, 20 years of forced, shock treatment, and just all of that just really, really haunted me. My whole family basically is, buried in a certain graveyard in Southern California. My grandfather's there. My grandma's going to be there. It just so happens that, because my mom and dad met in that area, that my dad's mother is also there. But she's in an unmarked grave. She does not even have a headstone or a name stone, nothing, a plaque, just a completely unmarked grave. So I went there and spent some time. I created like this, little laminated thing with her name on it, and put some little flowers there. She's buried outside. My grandparents and my grandmother's parents are actually inside in the huge mausoleum. But my dad's mother is outside in the Catholic section of the cemetery in an unmarked grave. So I went there, and I, grieved a little bit over that, that she was sort of forgotten, that she didn't even have a headstone. And, but it didn't resolve my own, sort of connection that I felt, this continuous haunting from her. Like something needed to be cleared and healed. I also had, a very in-depth and intuitive astrological reading on my natal chart. And out of that also came this idea that, I needed to have some ancestral healing. It wasn't very specific, but I already knew the moment that she told me that exactly what it was that needed to be done. So I started digging, and as time goes on, our genealogy records get more and more and more digitized, and we have more and more access to them, and it's a wonderful thing. I've been able to do such amazing, awesome genealogy work. And one of the things I started doing was, trying to connect more to this grandmother and her lineage. In 2013, it was such a huge, monumental year for me in so many ways, so many ways. I won't say it was an awakening, because, I feel like I had already had an awakening, but things just started lining up and flowing much more for me in 2012 and 2013. So in 2013, I actually, as I was doing genealogy research, came upon some information about my grandmother's father. And then he was actually orphaned from his father. They were living in Ireland at the time, and he had the man, the great grandfather, had taken his son out fishing at a lake there in southern Ireland, not far from Waterford. That's where the family was from. And he drowned. He drowned there in the lake in front of his son, who was my grandmother's father. So my grandmother's father, immigrated from Ireland. He grew up basically an orphan. I believe his mother also passed away at a very young age. Just even reading that story was like such a catharsis for me. I grieved that. And I could just see the lineage of, how his wounding was somehow translated into my grandmother. and then on to my father, and then on to me. So I really grieved that. I had a lot of tears, and I just felt into that. I created an altar for my grandmother. I have pictures of her when, with my dad when he was very, very young, and my aunt. It's a little family picture. It's, my grandmother, my grandfather, my dad, and my aunt, and a little black and white family picture, probably taken around, 1950 to 1951. I took that picture of her, and I put it up on an altar, and I lit a candle, and I put some sacred objects around it, and I just prayed for her to heal and release that. Life is ironic, and it's not ironic at the same time, because my daughter ended up being a psychiatric nurse, but this hospital where my daughter works is like literally 20 minutes away from where my grandmother spent 20 years of her life, and where she ultimately died in 1972. She died a few months before I was born, so my mom would have been pregnant with me at the time that my grandmother died. So it's very interesting, that, we come full circle, and here my daughter is a psychiatric nurse at a hospital that's 20 minutes away from where this grandmother that I never even met passed away. Very, very interesting. So anyway, back to the story of ancestral healing. That's what I had to do, is just really lean into that pain and open my heart up to, have the compassion for my ancestors, and connecting to that and understanding. Sort of doing a little ceremony for her, honoring her, and then I released it. And it wasn't like an immediate thing. I didn't walk away from that ceremony and feel like, oh, okay, this is released. But what did happen is I started to really have significant shifts. About that same time, after I did that ceremony for her of healing and releasing that ancestral curse, if you will, I started to have really significant shifts in my own process and narrative of the story I was telling myself about my depression. So I would have like these bouts of depression, these dark nights of the soul, these existential crises. I don't know what you want to call them. To me, I call it snake medicine. And I really identified it's just part of my shamanic path and my shamanic expression, and it's a necessary part of how I process. But prior to me coming to that understanding about myself, it was a narrative I had that I'm depressed, I struggle with depression, I've had this my whole life, and here we go again, another bout of depression. And so after I did that ceremony of cleansing, the narrative is when it started to shift. And the next sort of bout of depression I had, I really stepped out of it, and I started asking, why am I telling this narrative? Why am I calling this depression? What is this really? And, if you look at the symptoms of depression, like really the classic symptoms as they are in the DSM, and you look at really what I was experiencing within myself, the two things actually weren't really even the same thing. And so I started really looking more closely at, well, what is it then that I am experiencing? If this isn't truly psychiatric depression, what is this? And it was through that process that I was able to disentangle from the story, from the family curse, that depression and suicidality runs in my family. Another really tragic thing, about my family history is that I'm a third generation only child. I've talked about this many times. Through my maternal lineage, my mother's an only child, and her mother is an only child. Through my paternal lineage, my dad had one sister. That sister was quite a bit older than him, and she had 2 children. So biologically, I do have 2 cousins, but I didn't really grow up with them, and I didn't really know them as cousins per se. And, so for really all intents and purposes, I'm a third generation only child, and I don't have any real aunts and uncles that have been a part of my life. But my cousin, I had a female cousin and a male cousin, and they are older than me, and quite a bit older than me by 10 years or more. My female cousin, unfortunately, she never did have children of her own, but she married a man who had a daughter from a previous marriage, and her husband killed her and then committed suicide. So we have this sort of hanging on curse, this family tragedy, this legacy of this type of thing. It's just really, really sad. So in my life, I feel like I've cleared it, and that's how I did it, was going in to do as much of the genealogy research, because here in the United States, we don't come from this culture so much of the oral tradition. In a lot of cultures, like the Hispanic culture with the Dia de los Muertos, this is what they do. It's this oral tradition that's passed on from generation to generation to generation, and it's rigidly held. It has to be rigidly held and protected so that it doesn't get lost. And so, and the little boy in this movie, Coco, he struggles with that, the rigidity of it, and wanting to resist it and not understanding. And towards the end, then he comes to understand why this tradition is important. So the oral tradition in their culture is, they hand it down. So the family story is right there, not only in the oral story, but also, in the altars that they're setting up, with the family photos and the actual, ceremonial items that they're offering, that have to do with honoring the individual, the person in that family lineage. So I think that that's an amazing thing, and it's definitely something in our culture, modern American culture, that we don't have. We don't have that. So we lack this oral tradition. We lack this connection with our ancestors in a way. And, it's unfortunate. But it's a really good thing that we have digital access now to so much of genealogy record, because we can sort of glean, and if we lean into that work with any amount of intuitiveness, we can really, really glean what happened with our ancestors and what, sort of the culture for them could have been like, and start to identify patterns of, oh, that's why I am the way I am, and that's why this is that way. And because there is very clear, lines if we just do the work and follow them. So we're really lucky in that aspect, that although we've been cut off ancestrally, we don't have that oral tradition. We have digital access now, and that's only exponentially increasing day by day by day. And it's really an awesome tool. So I highly encourage you to, if you feel like you have a family curse, or there's certain aspects that you don't understand, why was my mom or my dad that way, or why was my grandma that way, lean into it, lean into that work, trace that, if they're not alive and you can ask them. If they're alive, ask them, by all means ask them. My grandma's 94, and I still try to, as much as I can, ask her questions, and I was lucky. I grew up with that sense, a really rich, deep sense of that. My grandfather in high school, he made this beautiful cedar hope chest, and it used to be upstairs in my grandma's room. And once or twice a year, I remember as a young child, she would take me up, and we would sit down in front of the hope chest, and she would open it up and pull everything out one by one, and she would talk to me about it. And all the things that were in there were sort of not necessarily sacred. They were just important things, to my family. Like my first outfit, and, my mom's baby book, and my parents' wedding album, and, just all these kind of things. And, obviously over time, I've actually outgrown that, spilling out of it, because I've added, the things from my family, my 3 kids, and, what should go in there. So I grew up with that, already, that sort of heritage and that connection, and the, spending the time in the oral tradition is telling the stories and talking about that. So I'm grateful to have had that. But even in that, it was somewhat disconnected from, my family lineage beyond, say, my mother, beyond my grandparents and my mother. So yeah, I think that's where genealogy research can really come into play. And again, you might have to, because it seems like it's very surface information, but you might have to actually lean into it a little bit more to find out what was happening at the time, in that location, and how these things could have influenced, your ancestors. So going back to the lunch that I went to where my friend was talking about, ancestral work and ancestral clearing, there was an African-American man who had an interesting situation. He was talking about how his sister had done a significant amount of genealogy research, and they were able to actually trace the mother's history all the way back until, the slave time, but then basically it abruptly ended. So he was asking, in this situation, what do you do, when you basically hit a wall for, whatever reason, and that would be an obvious reason, and it was interesting because my friend talked about, how even a lot of the slave records are becoming digitized now, and how really amazing it is that you would think that, oh, because names got changed or this or that. But you probably can, if you keep digging, get information to at least find out what general area of Africa that your family was from. And she talked about, she was married to a Mexican man, and she talked about that. Like, she was trying to research that side of the family for her children, because, as a father of her children. And, she struggled for 20 years. She just kept hitting dead ends, and thinking that she was never going to be able to do this. But just recently, she was saying, Mexico completely digitized all their records. So within a week, after 20 years of, dead end to dead end, within a week, she had like the whole entire family history going back like several generations, and there was a lot of trauma and stuff in their family, and how doing that work was really healing, because she was able to sit down with her daughter and say, this was your dad, this was his story, and just the compassion that opened up for them. And she talked about that, like they went to the son's wedding, and the ex-husband was there, and how historically that was a very, there's a lot of animosity, and just doing this ancestral work. They hadn't even talked to him about it, but just doing it within themselves, that her and the daughter were just so opened up and so full of love and compassion and forgiveness and understanding of why he had so much animosity, why he, was the way he was. And they saw the shift. They felt the shift when they went to the wedding. He was much more open, and he was pleasant, and they danced together. And so she also had this amazing testimony of ancestral healing that came through just doing the genealogy work and opening up your perspective to what the ancestors really went through. But anyway, going back to the African American man, I didn't really have an opportunity to speak up because, time was running short. But as he was talking about that and saying, like, what do you do if there's a wall? And she's encouraging him, the records are being digitized, and you can still, sort of, work towards that. And eventually you'll find out at least the general region from Africa that you're from. The piercing thought that I had towards this man is that, that's a perfect opportunity actually to, find somebody on the spiritual level that's doing that work. A shaman or somebody that's adept at doing that kind of work and can lean into that in the spiritual realm and access that information and bring back clues for you. That might actually help you to further that search, or even more, if there's a certain thing that you're not sure about, they can more definitely help you identify, if there's a curse or what the family curse is. Sometimes family curses are really obvious. I had a client a couple months ago who was telling me that her mother and her grandmother were both telling her that there was a family curse, that the women in the family can't find, stable, loving male partners in their lives. And so she was asking me, what do you think about that? And I told her, you're telling me it's a family curse. That right there tells me it is a family curse. Some people don't have that clear of a, statement about it. They just have this narrative. And so, I have to tune in and listen and really identify, oh, that's a family curse, which is not actually really hard for me to do. But for this woman to just come right out and tell me that, oh, my family's telling me I have a family curse, and she's telling me what the curse is, and then she's asking me what I think, and I'm telling her, well, just the fact that you're telling me that this is a family curse is evidence that this is a family curse. So then I was able to help her sort of shift on how she could clear that in her own life. So this is important work. It really, really is important work. And I think that, a lot of us, walking around in America today, we have these woundings. We have these ancestral woundings and these family curses. We may not even understand that that's what that is, or that that's what that's coming from, or, that this narrative that, I was raised with, or this, predominant feeling I can't get loose of, or whatever, that a lot of that can have to do with ancestors. So anyway, I just want to encourage you today to go watch that movie Coco if you're interested in cartoons at all. It's amazing, great story, and to, consider doing ancestral work. And if you feel like genealogy is not the way to go, or you've done that and you still are in a roadblock, you still feel that it's tied some way to your ancestors and you just can't quite put your finger on it or make it make sense in some way for you, you know, definitely seek services, seek shamanic services from someone that's open and willing and able, you know, to powerfully do that work and retrieve some of those clues and that information for you, and can also sort of guide you on how to help clear that. So anyway, that's really all I have to say about it today. I just want to thank you guys so much for watching. As always, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down below the video. If you want to get a hold of me for some reason, you can look me up on my public Facebook page. It's facebook.com/shamanic services, or through email at shamanicservices@amykshaw.com, or however else that you find. I'm all around. So anyway, thanks again, and have a great day. I love you guys so much.